Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. Lena had stopped checking her email weeks ago. Ever since Chris disappeared, her inbox had become a swirling mass of sympathy notes, false leads, and the occasional cruel message. Maybe he just wanted to get away from you, one stranger had written. She never answered those, never let them take up any more space in her mind than necessary. But tonight, she was desperate. She had exhausted every other option. Every thread of information had unraveled. So she clicked her inbox open and began sorting through the mess again. That's when she saw it. An email with no subject line, sent from an address she didn't recognize. Normally, she would have deleted it without a second thought, but something about the timing and the sender's name, J. W. Blackwood, snagged her attention. Her hand hovered over the delete button before she opened it. The message was short, almost too brief to believe. If you want to know what happened to your brother, come to Blackwood Estate. Details attached. She frowned, scanning the message again. It had no greeting, no signature, just that single chilling line. She clicked on the attached PDF and was met with a scanned invitation, printed on old, weathered parchment. The words Blackwood Estate were inscribed in flowing, ornate script. Beneath it was an address she didn't recognize and a date, March 25th, 2025, tomorrow. Lena's stomach tightened. She Googled the estate, but nothing came up. No records, no reviews, no history, just a blank void, as if it had been scrubbed from existence. The name Blackwood didn't return anything helpful either. Whoever had sent the invitation had gone to great lengths to keep this place a secret. For a moment, she considered forwarding the email to the police, or maybe to one of the online groups she'd been posting in. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, the logical part of her brain pushed back. What would she even say? Hi, I just got a cryptic invitation from someone I've never heard of. Should I go to this creepy old house tomorrow? It would sound ridiculous, and if it turned out to be a cruel prank, she'd only be wasting time she didn't have. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a picture of Chris, the one she'd set as his contact photo. She'd sent herself a daily reminder, a little nudge to keep searching, keep fighting. Seeing his face now felt like a sign. She stared at the invitation again, her thoughts spinning. What if this was the lead she'd been hoping for? The one chance to find out what had happened to him. Could she afford to ignore it? The invitation said to arrive by sundown. She checked the time. If she left early, she could make it in a few hours. She would need to drive through unfamiliar roads, but that didn't scare her. She'd gone to far worse places in the months since Chris disappeared, following up on every dubious lead, chasing down every shadowy tip. This was just another in a long line of desperate gambles. Lena closed the laptop and stood. She had a bag packed already. She always did, just in case she needed to leave on a moment's notice. The thought of stepping into the unknown again made her skin prickle, but she shoved the fear aside. She was used to that feeling now. Her brother's face lingered in her mind, the way his smile would break out like sunlight, how he used to joke that she worried too much. Well, Chris, I hope you're laughing at me now, she thought, because I'm going. With a deep breath, Lena grabbed her keys and slung her bag over her shoulder. Her heart thudded hard as she left her apartment, the invitation still glowing on her screen. If this was a trap, she'd deal with it. If it was real, if it truly led her to Chris, she couldn't let it slip away. The drive was endless. The farther Lena went, the more the trees seemed to close in, branches intertwining overhead to blot out the sky. Her GPS stopped working miles back, and the printed directions from the invitation were vague at best. After 2 hours of winding through dark, empty roads, she found herself pulling up a gravel path that didn't appear on any maps. The car's headlights barely pierced the dense foliage, and she could feel her pulse quicken as the gravel crunched beneath her tires. When the manor finally came into view, Lena's breath caught. The place was enormous, sprawling and ancient. with dark turrets that rose like blackened fingers against the twilight sky. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and countless windows, many shattered or coated in grime, stared out like hollow eyes. Despite its size, the manor appeared almost forgotten. There were no cars parked out front, no signs of life at all, just a massive set of oak doors and a flickering lantern hung above them. She parked her car near what looked like a former carriage house, now collapsed and overgrown with weeds. The air felt heavy, like a storm was pressing down on the estate, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. As she stepped out, the gravel seemed to shift beneath her feet, and she noticed the faint scent of rot wafting from the underbrush. The place felt wrong, and for a moment she considered turning back. But then she saw it, etched into the ironwork of the manor's gate was the same crest from the invitation. She was in the right place. Lena walked up the stone steps toward the front doors. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door creaked open on its own. She froze. There was no one there, just darkness spilling out like ink from the doorway. "Hello," she called, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. No answer. The air seemed to thrum around her, but she stepped inside anyway. The entry hall was vast and cold, with ceilings that soared so high she couldn't make out their edges. Dust covered every surface, muting the once rich carpets and the gilded frames of paintings that lined the walls. In the center of the room stood a marble staircase that split into two curving arms, leading to the upper floors. A massive chandelier hung above her, its crystals dulled by age, swaying gently even though there was no draft. "Lena Vance," a deep, calm voice said. She jumped, spinning to see a man standing in the shadows of the hall. He was tall, dressed in a somber black suit, his face pale and sharp, like a carving out of bone. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his dark eyes never left her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound firm. "I am the caretaker of this house," he said. His tone was measured, almost soothing, though there was an odd quality to it, as if each word was chosen too carefully. "I trust you received the invitation?" Lena nodded, gripping the strap of her bag. "Who sent it? What do you know about my brother?" He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You will find what you're looking for here, Miss Vance, but all things come in time. For now, please allow me to show you to your room." Before she could protest, he turned and began walking down a dim hallway. His footsteps were silent on the dusty floor. For a moment, Lena hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get back in her car and drive as far away as possible. But the memory of Chris's voice on the other end of the line that last night, frantic, afraid, propelled her forward. She followed. The caretaker led her to a small room on the second floor. It was plain, with a bed, a writing desk, and a single window that looked out onto the dark forest. Everything was old but surprisingly clean, as if someone had taken care to prepare it for her. He handed her a brass key. "Rest for the night," he said, his voice soft now. "We'll speak more tomorrow." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left, leaving Lena standing alone in the doorway. She closed the door and locked it, her fingers trembling as they turned the key. Dropping her bag by the bed, she sat down and stared out the window. The forest was utterly still, the trees casting long skeletal shadows in the fading light. But somewhere beyond them, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, just the briefest shift, like something darting from one tree to the next. She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing, just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But as the last light faded from the sky, Lena felt a chill seep into the room. It wasn't just the cold of an old drafty house, it was a deeper kind of cold, the kind that crept under her skin and made her feel as though something unseen was watching her from the darkness. She reached for her bag and pulled out her flashlight. She wouldn't sleep tonight. Not until she figured out what she'd gotten herself into. Lena had always considered herself a rational person, the kind of person who would flick on a flashlight, see that the coat on the chair was just a coat, not a ghost, and then roll her eyes at herself. But as the night dragged on, the rational explanations she relied on felt thinner and thinner. It started around midnight when the house seemed to exhale. Not literally, of course, but that's what it felt like. A long, low creak that ran through the walls, the floors, even the bed frame. Lena sat bolt upright, clutching her flashlight. The sound lingered, fading in and out like a breath in a dark room. She shone the beam around her bedroom. The walls were still, the furniture unchanged. A patch of ivy scratched faintly at the window, but there was no wind to speak of. The caretaker hadn't returned, and as far as she could tell, she was the only living person on this floor of the sprawling manor. "Get it together, Lena," she whispered to herself. "It's just an old house. Old houses make noises." But then she heard it. Her name, faint and low, whispered as though from far away. Lena. Her stomach flipped, and she gripped the flashlight tighter. It had been so soft that she wasn't sure she'd really heard it. Maybe it was the wind or the trees outside. Maybe she was imagining it. Then it came again, clearer this time. A faint, desperate whisper, "Lena, help me." Her heart stopped. The voice was familiar. It wasn't just any voice, it was Chris's. She swung the flashlight toward the walls, running the beam over the faded wallpaper. The floral pattern was peeling at the corners, and faint stains bloomed near the ceiling. She pressed her ear to the wall, holding her breath. "Chris?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Chris, is that you? Help me!" The voice pleaded again, barely audible. It sounded as though it were coming from behind the wall. "Lena, please!" She felt a strange, buzzing pressure in her skull, like her ears were straining to catch the faintest sounds. She rapped on the wall with her knuckles. "Chris, where are you? How do I get to you?" The whispering grew faint, and then silence fell. She strained her ears, waiting, but the house seemed to settle again. The only sound was the distant ticking of some unseen clock. Lena stumbled back to the bed, her mind racing. She had to be imagining things. Chris was missing, sure, but hearing his voice through the walls of a creepy old mansion, that was impossible. She needed sleep, needed to think clearly. Maybe the stress of the past few months had finally caught up with her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She pulled her phone from her bag, holding it up like a talisman against the darkness. The screen showed no service. She couldn't call anyone, couldn't reach out. She hadn't even told anyone where she was going. The thought hit her like a cold wave. She was completely alone out here, with no one to know if something went wrong. "Get it together," she muttered again, but her voice sounded hollow. She turned off the flashlight and crawled under the heavy quilt on the bed. It smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet, like rotting fruit. She tried to tell herself it was fine, that she'd get some rest and figure it out in the morning. But the room felt too quiet now, too watchful. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of ivy against the glass, made her jump. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out. And that's when she heard the whisper again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just her name now. It was a cry for help, muffled, choked, but undeniably Chris's voice. It sounded like he was just on the other side of the wall, as if he were calling to her from some hidden space. "Lena, please, I'm trapped." She shot out of bed, flashlight in hand. She ran the beam across the wallpaper again, searching for any cracks, any signs of a hidden door. She peeled back a section of the faded paper, exposing rough wood beneath. Nothing. No seams, no panels, just solid wall. Her breath came in short gasps. She clawed at the wall in frustration. "Chris, I'm here! Just tell me where you are!" The voice faltered, growing faint again. She pressed her ear to the wall, but there was nothing. Just silence. Her stomach churned. Could it have been a trick of her imagination? Or was this place somehow amplifying her fears, playing on her hopes and desperation? She didn't sleep that night. The whispers never returned, but she stayed up, flashlight in hand, watching the walls. She felt like the house was breathing around her, a slow, patient rhythm. When dawn broke through the dirty window pane, she was still sitting on the bed, her mind a jumble of dread and determination. She would find out what was going on. She would get answers. And if Chris was here, she wouldn't stop until she found him. Lena didn't bother unpacking. Her bag sat slumped on the floor by the bed, still zipped tight, as if unpacking might make her stay feel too real. She spent the morning wandering the halls of the manor. The caretaker was nowhere to be found, and the house remained as quiet as it had been the night before. Too quiet. The architecture was a strange mix of grandeur and decay. Massive stone fireplaces anchored every other room, but their mantels were coated in grime, and many of the carved details had been chipped away. Heavy, velvet curtains hung limply beside tall windows, their once rich color faded to an ashen gray. Every surface seemed muted, as though the life had been leached from the house over decades. Yet the air carried a faint scent of wax, as if someone, somewhere, was trying to keep the house from collapsing entirely. But there were signs of more recent activity. In one room, Lena found a cup of tea on a side table, the liquid inside cold but not yet stained with dust. In another, a half-burned candle rested in a tarnished holder, its wick still blackened from a recent flame. Someone had been here, and not long ago. The oddest discovery came when she stumbled into what must have once been a sitting room. A cracked mirror hung over the fireplace, its glass warped and clouded with age. Below it, the ashes in the hearth had been disturbed, as if something had been dug out. She leaned closer and saw faint scratch marks in the soot, as if someone had clawed at the remnants of whatever had been burned there. She shivered and moved on, trying to shake the image from her mind. By afternoon, Lena was exhausted. The restless night and the house's oppressive atmosphere were taking their toll. She returned to her room and flopped onto the bed, staring up at the peeling wallpaper on the ceiling. The silence pressed against her ears, heavy and suffocating. She turned on the old lamp beside the bed, but its weak glow didn't help much. The shadows still crowded the corners, and the air felt just as thick. When night fell, the house grew colder. Lena pulled the quilt tightly around herself, but it did little to ward off the chill. She'd meant to explore more, maybe even venture outside to check the grounds, but the oppressive weight of the house made it hard to summon the will. Instead, she sat at the small writing desk in her room, flipping through the journal she'd found under the bed that morning. The journal was old, the leather cover cracked and the pages brittle. Most of the entries were barely legible, scrawled in frantic, looping handwriting. The author, whose name was never mentioned, wrote about the master of the house in reverent, fearful terms. They described strange happenings, doors that opened on their own, objects that moved without a sound, and shadowy figures that seemed to watch from the corners of their vision. They wrote about sacrifices, though the word was never explained. Lena felt her stomach twist. It could have been nothing more than the ramblings of an unstable mind. But after what she'd heard the night before, Chris's voice calling from the walls, she wasn't so sure. As she read, a faint sound caught her attention. She froze, listening. It was the scratching of something sharp against wood, soft but insistent. It came from outside her door. Her heartbeat quickened. She closed the journal and slowly reached for the flashlight. The scratching continued, deliberate and steady. Then it stopped. She held her breath, every muscle tense, waiting to hear it again. For several long moments there was nothing, just the hum of silence. She exhaled, letting her shoulders relax. Maybe it had been her imagination. Maybe the old house was settling. And then the doorknob rattled. She leapt from the chair, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The knob twisted back and forth, once, twice, before going still. She stared at it, her pulse hammering. The door was locked. It should have been safe. But whoever or whatever was out there clearly didn't care. "Who's there?" Lena called, her voice stronger than she felt. No answer. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. The hallway beyond was silent. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing to indicate someone was still there. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, then unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack. The hallway was empty. Pale moonlight spilled through a far-off window, casting long shadows on the faded carpet. She stepped into the corridor, her bare feet brushing against something gritty. Looking down, she saw a faint trail of dried mud leading away from her door. Her chest tightened. She followed the trail down the hallway, her flashlight beam bouncing off the cracked wallpaper and dusty frames. The trail led to another door, this one ajar. She hesitated, then nudged it open with the toe of her shoe. It was a storage room. Shelves of old linens and tarnished candlesticks lined the walls. The muddy trail ended abruptly in the center of the room, where a single, muddy footprint stood, stark against the dusty floor. The room felt wrong. It was the same heavy wrongness she'd felt in her bedroom, only stronger, more concentrated. Lena stepped back, her throat dry. She turned and hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the flashlight, and waited for dawn. Something was in this house, something she couldn't explain. The caretaker's strange demeanor, the journal's ramblings, the whispers in the walls, none of it made sense. But it was real, and it was waiting. The next morning, Lena woke with a stiff neck and aching shoulders. At some point during the night, she had curled up in the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight. She didn't remember falling asleep, only the steady, gnawing sense of being watched. When she finally mustered the nerve to leave her room, the house seemed quieter than ever. The air was damp and cool, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made her skin prickle. She needed answers, but more importantly, she needed to figure out who or what had been outside her door. She made her way down the grand staircase. Her footsteps echoed hollowly on the marble, and the faint dust she kicked up seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. At the bottom of the stairs, she hesitated. The main hall stretched out before her, its tall windows half covered by tattered curtains. Pale daylight spilled in, but it did little to warm the space. Miss Vance, Lena nearly jumped. She turned to see the caretaker standing at the foot of the staircase, his posture as upright and formal as ever. His black suit looked the same as it had the day before, immaculate and unwrinkled. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost serene, but it sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated, considering how much she wanted to reveal. "There was someone outside my door last night." The caretaker tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "This is a very old house," he said. "Sometimes it makes unusual sounds. The wood shifts, the pipes creak. I assure you there is nothing to be concerned about." Lena frowned. This wasn't just a noise. Someone was out there. I heard scratching on my door, and the knob turned. For a moment, the caretaker didn't respond. His gaze seemed to drift past her, toward the upper floors, as if he were listening for something. Then he nodded slowly. "I will look into it," he said. "In the meantime, please help yourself to breakfast in the dining room." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. Lena didn't follow him. Instead, she turned toward the dining room. The thought of food seemed absurd after everything that had happened, but her stomach grumbled in protest. She hadn't eaten since she arrived. The dining room was cavernous, with a long, polished table that could easily seat 24 guests. Silver candelabras lined the center, and faint streaks of sunlight slanted through the high windows. A tray of fruit, bread, and a carafe of dark coffee sat near the head of the table, along with a folded napkin and a single china plate. The sight of it struck Lena as deeply unsettling. It was too deliberate, too pristine, especially in a house that otherwise seemed forgotten and decayed. As she stepped toward the table, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall behind her. She spun around, flashlight raised, only to see a man and a woman standing in the doorway. They looked just as startled to see her as she was to see them. The man, in his late 40s, was short and wiry, with thinning hair and glasses perched on a slightly crooked nose. He held a leather satchel tight to his chest, as if it were a lifeline. The woman, probably in her early 30s, was taller and had an air of nervous energy about her. She was dressed in a hiking jacket and boots, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. "Who are you?" Lena asked. The man adjusted his glasses. "I'm Howard," he said cautiously, "and this is—" "Yvonne," the woman interrupted. Her voice was sharp, but her eyes darted around the room. "We got an invitation. Said we might find answers here." Lena felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of answers?" Howard glanced nervously at Yvonne before replying. "Well, answers about my wife. She disappeared 6 months ago." Yvonne shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm looking for my sister. She's been missing for nearly a year." Lena stared at them, her pulse quickening. They were like her, desperate, grasping at any thread of hope. "You both got invitations too?" Yvonne nodded. "We arrived this morning. Didn't see anyone else. No cars, no staff, just that creepy guy in the suit. He showed us to our rooms and said breakfast was ready." Lena took a step closer. "Did either of you hear anything last night? Strange noises? Maybe someone walking around?" Howard shook his head. "No, but something does feel off about this place." Before Lena could press further, another voice spoke from the doorway. "Looks like I'm not the only one." They all turned to see a tall, muscular man in his late 20s leaning against the doorframe. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, and his face was set in a wary scowl. "Name's Mitch," he said. "I'm here for my brother. Haven't seen him in months." Lena's mind raced. 4 of them. 4 invitations, all leading to this house. All of them looking for someone who had vanished. The thought chilled her. How many more would show up? As they exchanged uneasy introductions, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed dimmer now, as if the house itself resented their presence. When they sat down to eat, the food tasted stale and dry, but no one mentioned it. They were too busy whispering their theories, each one more far-fetched than the last. The caretaker returned briefly, gliding silently into the room to collect their plates. He said nothing, offering only a tight-lipped smile when asked about the missing people they had come searching for. Then he disappeared again, leaving them to wonder if he was the only staff member or if others were hiding in the shadows. As the day wore on, Lena felt the tension in the house grow. It wasn't just the silence or the creaks in the floorboards. It was something heavier, something she couldn't quite name. She could see it in the others' faces too. The way their eyes darted to the darkened corners, the way their voices grew softer when they spoke, they were all starting to feel it. And as night approached, the question lingered, unspoken. If so many people were vanishing, what would stop it from happening to them? Lena spent the rest of the day exploring the manor with the others, their growing sense of unease binding them into an uneasy alliance. They moved from room to room, opening doors to abandoned parlors, crumbling libraries, and ballrooms that must once have shone with grandeur. But now everything was dust and silence. The caretaker's presence was unnerving. He appeared only briefly throughout the day, always at the edges of their sight, moving silently through the halls. He never answered questions directly. When Howard pressed him about the history of the house, or whether other guests had stayed here recently, the caretaker would only smile thinly and say, "This house has its secrets. Some you will uncover, and some will remain as they are." By late afternoon, they had reached the second floor, a dim corridor lined with doors, each one locked. Lena tried every handle, her frustration mounting. Every door rattled but refused to budge, until finally she came to the very last one at the end of the hall. This door was different. The wood was darker, the brass knob polished and gleaming. The faint scent of something sweet and decayed seeped through the crack beneath it. And when Lena tried the handle, it wouldn't even turn. She glanced back at the others. "Help me with this." Mitch stepped forward, his broad shoulders flexing as he tried to force the door open. But the handle wouldn't give, not even a wiggle. "It's like it's frozen shut," he grunted. "What the hell kind of door is this?" Yvonne stared at it uneasily, her arms crossed. "Maybe it's better we don't open it." Howard nodded quickly. "She's right. What if it's locked for a reason? I mean, the caretaker clearly doesn't want us poking around here." Lena's jaw tightened. "If we're going to find out what's going on in this house, we can't keep avoiding things just because they're scary." She rapped on the door with her knuckles. "What's behind here? Why is it locked?" She didn't expect an answer. But then the faintest sound drifted through the door, a whisper, soft and weak. Lena, her heart stopped. She pressed her ear against the wood. "Chris, help me." The voice was faint, choked with desperation. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, muffled and faint, but it was him. She knew that voice. She turned to the others, her eyes wide. "It's Chris! He's in there!" Mitch and Yvonne exchanged worried looks. "Are you sure?" Mitch asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I know my brother's voice," Lena snapped. "He's behind this door." She turned the knob again, yanking at it with all her strength, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. She stepped back, trying to steady herself. If Chris was behind this door, then this house was hiding far more than they'd realized. "We need to get it open," she said. "We need to find a way." Howard adjusted his glasses nervously. "And what if it's not him? What if it's, I don't know, something else? Who else would it be?" Lena demanded, her voice rising. "This house is connected to the people we're looking for. You said it yourself, your wife, your sister, my brother. It's all tied together. We need to find out what's in there." Yvonne glanced at the door again, her expression skeptical. "If that's really him, why doesn't he just open it? Why doesn't he shout or scream or, I don't know, bang on the door? Why is it just a whisper?" Lena hesitated. She had no answer. But she couldn't let doubt stop her. She turned back to the door, her hands trembling. The caretaker's voice cut through the silence. "Miss Vance," he said from behind them. Lena jumped, spinning around to face him. He stood at the end of the hall, as calm and unbothered as ever. His expression was placid, but his dark eyes seemed to bore into her. "This wing of the house is not for guests," he said. "I must ask you to return downstairs." Lena's frustration boiled over. "My brother is in there," she shouted. "I heard him. I know he's in that room." The caretaker tilted his head slightly. "I assure you, no one is in that room." "You're lying," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she didn't care. "You know what's going on here. You know who's missing. If you're not going to help, then just stay out of the way." The caretaker's expression didn't change, but a faint ripple of something disapproval perhaps passed over his features. "It is unwise to open doors that are meant to stay closed," he said softly. And then, without another word, he turned and walked back down the hall. Lena stared after him, her anger warring with the gnawing doubt that Yvonne had planted. What if it wasn't Chris's voice? What if she was imagining it? But no, she had heard it. She was certain. She turned back to the door, her mind racing. If they couldn't force it open, maybe there was another way, another key, another route, something. She needed to find it, no matter what. By the time Lena reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already slipping behind the distant hills. The caretaker hadn't been seen since his warning, and the others had retreated to their rooms, growing more withdrawn with each passing hour. Lena felt trapped. The locked room at the end of the hall gnawed at her thoughts, but no amount of searching had yielded a key or any other clue. That's when she decided to explore the woods. The invitation hadn't mentioned the forest, just the house itself, but she couldn't ignore the way it loomed at the edges of the property, dense and impenetrable. There was something about the way the trees gathered, their branches knotting together like black veins, that made her uneasy. It felt like the woods were watching, waiting. If there were answers to be found, they wouldn't come from pacing the same dusty halls over and over. She grabbed a flashlight and set out into the gloom. The first few steps were unremarkable, if slightly eerie. Dry leaves crackled beneath her boots, and the flashlight's beam swept over tree trunks covered in moss and lichen. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp earth. She told herself this was just a forest like any other, nothing special about it, but her nerves prickled anyway, as though the woods were alive with 1,000 unseen eyes. The deeper she went, the darker it became. Even with the flashlight, the trees seemed to draw closer, their shadows lengthening and twisting. The ground grew uneven, roots snaking up through the soil to trip her. Once, she turned to look behind her and froze. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shape darting between the trees. But when she swung the flashlight around, the forest was still. Only the whisper of wind through the branches broke the silence. She pressed on, her pulse quickening. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. She hadn't realized how far she'd walked until she stopped to catch her breath and looked back. The house was no longer visible. A small wave of panic surged in her chest. She had planned to stay close enough to see the lights of the manor, but now the woods had swallowed everything. It was then she noticed the markings. Carved into the trunks of several trees were strange, jagged symbols. They weren't the sort of carvings left by bored hikers or playful kids. These were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Lena ran her fingers over one, feeling the rough grooves. The symbol had an unsettling symmetry, almost as though it had grown there naturally, rather than been carved by human hands. Her flashlight picked up another one a few yards away. Then another. Each symbol was different, but all had the same sharp, angular style. She turned in a slow circle, the light casting long shadows. The markings seemed to multiply the deeper she looked. She thought she could see a faint pattern in how they were arranged, like they were forming a boundary or a path. Her breath hitched as the realization dawned on her. These symbols weren't random. They were a warning or a trap. She backed away from the nearest tree, her heart hammering. Maybe coming out here alone had been a mistake. She had no idea what these symbols meant, who had carved them, or why. But the air felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was closing in. And then she heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl, rising from somewhere just out of sight. Her flashlight wavered as her hands shook. She swung the beam in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, sending a shiver down her spine. She turned and started walking quickly back the way she'd come. Or at least, she thought it was the way back. The trees all looked the same now, the symbols blurring together. She couldn't tell if she was retracing her steps or plunging deeper into the forest. She tried to steady her breathing, listening for the faintest trace of the house's distant sounds, the creak of old wood, the whisper of curtains. But there was nothing, only that low growl, growing louder, stalking her from somewhere she couldn't see. Then the flashlight caught something ahead, a break in the trees. Relief surged through her. If she could just get out of the woods, just find open ground, she'd be safe. She broke into a run, tripping over roots, stumbling through underbrush. The growl followed her, almost like laughter. She didn't dare look back. When she burst into the clearing, she froze. There in the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, the bark blackened and split as though burned from within. The roots curled and knotted over the ground like skeletal fingers, and at its base was a jagged stone altar. The altar was stained with something dark, something that had soaked into the rock over countless years. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the altar. The symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the dark. The growl seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that she could feel in her chest. The tree loomed above her, its branches like outstretched arms, its roots like grasping claws. This wasn't just a tree. This was something ancient, something alive. She took a step back, and her heel caught on a root. She stumbled, barely catching herself, and as she did, she thought she heard a voice, a whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, like a memory, but she recognized it. Lena. Her blood ran cold. It was Chris's voice again. It came from the direction of the tree. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Her body screamed at her to run, to get out of the forest and never look back. But her brother's voice called to her, faint and fragile, and she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had to figure out what this place was, what it had to do with him. With trembling hands, she approached the altar. Lena barely slept that night. She sat on the edge of her bed with the journal open in her lap, the faded scrawl blurring before her tired eyes. The forest haunted her thoughts, the ancient tree, the symbols carved into the trunks, the voice that sounded like her brother's. And most of all, that altar, its surface stained dark as if it had absorbed something unholy over centuries. The journal provided little comfort. The writer had descended into paranoia, describing the house as alive and hungry. They wrote of people who came seeking refuge only to be taken, though by what or whom they never explained. They mentioned the woods as the house's veins, and the altar as its beating heart. The entries became more disjointed, the handwriting sloppier, until they abruptly stopped altogether. When dawn broke, Lena felt no relief. The light did nothing to banish the cold weight in her chest. The others had noticed it too. Yvonne was sitting in the dining room, picking at her food, her face pale and drawn. Howard paced back and forth, muttering to himself. Even Mitch seemed unnerved, his usual bravado replaced with a guarded, watchful silence. "What's out there?" Yvonne asked at last, her voice low. "In the woods. Did anyone else hear it last night?" Howard stopped pacing. "I heard something, a kind of rumbling, like an earthquake, but softer, Helen." "It wasn't an earthquake," Lena said. She set down her coffee, which had gone cold in her hands. "I saw something, a tree, a stone altar. It wasn't normal, and I heard." She hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. "I heard Chris's voice. I think he's connected to that place." Mitch leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "So what? Are you saying the woods took him?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. "But that altar, it's tied to the house, the symbols in the forest, the way the trees felt wrong. It all feels connected." Howard adjusted his glasses nervously. "This house isn't right. I don't think it ever was." Yvonne shot him a sharp look. "What are you talking about?" "I did some research before I came," Howard said. He rubbed his temples, looking as if he regretted even bringing it up. "There's not much about the estate on record, but what little I found." He trailed off, then shook his head. "It's bad. People vanish. Always have. I think this place lures them here, us here, and I think that thing out in the woods has something to do with it." Lena's heart sank. If Howard was right, then the invitation she'd received wasn't just a clue. It was a trap. She stood and paced the length of the dining room. What if this house is more than just a house? The journal I found, whoever wrote it said the house is alive. And the altar, it's like it's feeding off the forest, off the people who come here. Yvonne frowned, her arms crossed tightly. That doesn't make sense. A house can't just eat people. No, but something else could, Mitch said. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his unease. If that altar's part of some ritual or curse, then maybe the house is just an extension of it. The thing out in the woods, it could be what's really in control. Lena shivered, the memory of the altar seeping back into her mind. The stone, the carvings, the whisper of Chris's voice. They were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. But one thing was certain. They were running out of time. The longer they stayed, the more the house seemed to pull them in, draining them of their will to leave. I'm going back out there, Lena said, tonight. Howard and Yvonne stared at her as though she'd lost her mind. Are you serious? Yvonne asked. After what you just told us? If there's any chance Chris is out there, I have to take it, Lena said firmly. I can't just sit here and wait for the house to do whatever it's trying to do. Mitch nodded, his jaw set. I'll go too. We'll figure out what's really going on. Howard started to protest, but Yvonne cut him off. Fine. If you're both going, then we should all go. Strength in numbers, right? Lena wasn't sure that numbers would matter against whatever was controlling this place, but she nodded anyway. The thought of going back out there alone was too much to bear. If they were going to face the forest and whatever it hid, they needed to do it together. As the day passed, they made preparations, gathering what few supplies they had. Flashlights, a couple of knives from the kitchen, and the journal were all they could muster. When night fell again, they stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the dark. Lena felt the forest calling to her, pulling her forward with an almost magnetic force. She took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows, the others close behind. The four of them entered the woods as night enveloped the estate. The trees, so twisted and gnarled, seemed alive in the faint glow of their flashlights. Lena led the way, her stomach tightening with every step. The eerie symbols carved into the bark reappeared before long, each marking drawing her closer to the memory of the altar. This feels different, Mitch muttered, his voice low. The air, it's heavier than last night. Lena nodded without replying. The forest seemed more oppressive now, the shadows pressing in on them, distorting the paths. The faint thrum she had heard at the altar the night before began to return, a low pulse that she felt more in her chest than her ears. She didn't need to tell the others. From their tense, darting glances, she knew they could feel it too. They reached the clearing and stopped dead in their tracks. The altar was glowing, not brightly, just a faint, sickly luminescence that seemed to come from the grooves of the symbols carved into the stone. The twisted tree loomed behind it, its blackened trunk looking more grotesque in the pale light. Lena shone her flashlight on the altar's surface and froze. Something was lying on it, something dark and slick, a writhing, pulsing shape that made her stomach churn. What the hell is that? Yvonne whispered. Lena didn't answer. She stepped closer, her flashlight shaking. As she approached, the writhing form on the altar seemed to react to her presence. It stilled, then quivered, as if sensing her. A voice rose from the shadows around them, smooth and calm. You've come seeking answers. They all turned, flashlights darting wildly, but the speaker remained hidden. The voice had a quality that made Lena's skin crawl, an odd, melodic tone that seemed to reverberate inside her head. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling. I am the caretaker of this house, the voice replied. Not the one who tends to your needs, but the true caretaker, the one who ensures the cycle continues. The air grew colder. Lena felt her breath fog in front of her face. She gripped the flashlight tighter. What cycle? What do you mean? A faint chuckle emerged from the dark. You've already begun to see it. The house is not merely wood and stone. It is alive, and it hungers. It lures the lost, the desperate. It draws them here, to this place, where their suffering can be harvested. Yvonne let out a small gasp. Howard stumbled back, his flashlight beam shaking. Mitch set his jaw and stepped forward. What the hell is this? Who's behind it? It is no single person, the voice answered. It is older than any one being. The master of the house does not walk among you. It is woven into the fabric of this place, the pulse that runs through its walls, the thrum beneath the soil. You cannot fight it, and you cannot run from it. You can only accept its will. Lena's heart raced. "No," she said firmly. "I won't accept it. I came here for my brother. Where is he? What did you do to him?" The voice softened, but its tone carried a sinister edge. "Your brother, like the others, is part of the house now. His fear, his pain, they sustain it. They keep it strong. But you have a choice. You may remain here, join him, and find peace in the house's embrace. Or you may leave if you have the strength. But know this, if you leave, you will never find him again." Lena's knees felt weak. The weight of the words pressed down on her chest. What does that mean?" "The house offers sanctuary to those who surrender," the voice said. "It holds them close, protects them from the pain of the world. But if you resist, it will find other ways to feed. It always does." A gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing their flashlights in an instant. The glow of the altar became their only light, and the shape upon it writhed again, more violently this time. The shadows around them deepened, and Lena could feel the presence of something vast and malevolent all around her. "Leave if you wish," the voice said, now barely a whisper. "But the house will remember you. It always remembers." Then, just as suddenly as it began, the thrum faded. The glow dimmed, and the forest fell silent once more. The others scrambled to relight their flashlights, their beams flickering on and off until they finally held steady. The altar was empty now. The writhing form had vanished, leaving only the faintly glowing symbols etched into the stone. "What was that?" Howard asked, his voice trembling. "What did we just hear?" "Not a man," Mitch said quietly, "not anything human." Lena stared at the altar, her mind racing. If the house itself was behind this, if it was truly alive, then they were more trapped than she had feared. Whatever choice the voice had given her, it wasn't real. There was no leaving, not without answers, not without Chris. She turned to the others, her voice steady despite her fear. "We have to find a way to stop it." "Stop it?" Yvonne said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You heard that thing. This place isn't like anything we've ever dealt with. How do you stop a house that's alive?" "I don't know," Lena admitted, "but I'm not leaving until I try." Lena's determination to resist the house burned brighter as the group made their way back through the woods. The caretaker's words echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside. The house was not invincible. It might be ancient, it might be powerful, but it couldn't keep taking people, couldn't keep taking Chris without consequences. As they emerged from the forest's edge, Lena's flashlight caught something she hadn't noticed before. To the right of the estate, behind a rusted iron gate and tangled hedgerows, stood what looked like a garden. She had passed it when she first arrived, but in her desperation to enter the house, she hadn't given it much thought. Now, something about it seemed significant, like it was calling to her. She stopped and turned to the others. "What's over there?" Yvonne followed Lena's gaze and frowned. "I thought it was just overgrown shrubs. You think it's important?" "I don't know. But this house keeps secrets. We need to check every inch of this place." Howard glanced nervously toward the house. "If that thing we heard in the woods is connected to the house, then poking around in its backyard might not be the best idea." Lena didn't wait for their agreement. She pushed through the tall grass and brambles, the iron gate creaking open at her touch. Beyond it lay a space that had once been orderly and cultivated. Rows of hedges formed twisted, uneven lines, and old stone benches were scattered across the grounds. What little light the moon provided reflected off dew-soaked leaves, casting a silvery sheen over everything. "Look at these," Mitch said, pointing at a series of statues. They were life-sized, carved from weathered stone, and each depicted a figure in a moment of distress. A woman shielding her face with her hands, a man on his knees, mouth open in a scream, a child clutching at something unseen, their face frozen in terror. Their expressions were so vivid, so lifelike, that Lena's stomach turned. "These aren't just statues," she murmured. They're memorials or warnings." Howard shone his flashlight onto the base of one of the statues. There was a small plaque, worn and tarnished. The engraving was nearly illegible, but he could just make out the name, Margaret S., 1897. "This garden is older than it looks," he said. "Whoever Margaret was, she must have lived here. Maybe she fell victim to the house. Or maybe the house used her. Lena said, like it's using everyone else, feeding on them. She turned to another statue, but this one was different. It wasn't just worn, it was broken. The stone figure's arms had been shattered off, and the face had eroded almost entirely. Something about it unsettled her more than the others. And then she noticed the ground. At first glance, it looked like any other garden bed, dark soil, patches of moss, the occasional weed. But as Lena knelt and brushed the dirt with her hand, she saw the pale gleam of something beneath. She dug lightly, her fingers trembling. Within moments, she uncovered a bone. "Is that?" Yvonne started, but her voice caught in her throat. "It's human," Lena said softly. She couldn't explain how she knew. She just did. The texture, the size, it wasn't the remains of an animal. This place wasn't a garden, it was a burial ground. Or worse. She kept digging. The others joined her reluctantly, their flashlights bouncing across the ground as they worked. More bones emerged, small ones, large ones, rib bones, a femur. Even a skull, its empty sockets staring up at them. "Holy, this isn't just one person," Mitch said, his voice low. "It's dozens, maybe more." Howard stepped back, pale and shaking. "We need to stop. This is too much. We can't do anything here. The house, it's everywhere. It's inside the walls, the floors. We can't fight it." Lena stood, wiping dirt from her hands. "We have to. This proves it. The house doesn't just consume people. It leaves pieces of them behind. It's using their fear, their pain, and then it discards what it doesn't need." "What are you going to do?" Yvonne asked, her voice trembling. "Confront it? Threaten it?" "I don't know yet," Lena admitted. "But this place isn't invincible. Whatever it is, curse, spirit, entity, it had a beginning. It was created. That means it can be destroyed." Mitch nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "If we do anything, we need a plan. We can't just charge into the house and start smashing furniture, hoping it'll break some curse." Lena looked back toward the house, its looming silhouette barely visible beyond the gate. "We start by finding its source," she said. "The altar, the woods, the bones, everything ties back to something older than the house itself. Something buried beneath it. That's what's keeping it alive." The group fell silent, the weight of their discovery settling heavily on their shoulders. The bone garden seemed to watch them as they left, the statues standing sentinel, their expressions frozen in terror. Lena couldn't stop thinking about the bones beneath the soil. Her mind raced with questions as she led the group back toward the house. Who were those people? How long had the house been feeding on them? More than ever, she was convinced that if they didn't act soon, they'd join those remains beneath the bone garden, another offering to whatever the house served. Once they reached the manor, the air inside felt heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the house knew what they had seen. The caretaker's usual silence only added to the tension. He appeared briefly in the dining room doorway, his dark eyes scanning the group. Lena could have sworn his gaze lingered on her longer than the others. Then he was gone again, as if he'd never been there at all. The others exchanged uneasy glances. No one sat down. They gathered near the long dining table, the dim chandelier above them casting faint shadows that seemed to shift whenever they looked away. "Something's changed," Yvonne whispered. "It feels different." "It's the house," Lena said. "It knows what we saw. It knows we're onto it." Howard fidgeted nervously with his glasses. "What do we do? We can't just dig up bones and hope it solves anything. We need to get to the source," Lena said. "It's not just the bones. The journal I found talked about sacrifices, offerings. The house takes what it needs. But why? What's it trying to keep going?" "The altar," Mitch said. "You think it all comes back to that?" "I do," Lena said. "The altar, the woods, the people who disappear, it's all connected. We need to go back, but we need to be ready. We have to figure out what it wants." "What it wants," Yvonne said sharply. "Are you listening to yourself? This isn't some fairy tale where we can bargain our way out of this. The house doesn't care what we want." Lena stared at the table, her fists clenched. "I'm not saying we bargain. I'm saying we understand it. If we know why it needs these offerings, we can find a way to stop it." Howard shook his head, his voice trembling. "You keep saying that, but what does it mean? How do we stop a house?" "I don't know yet," Lena admitted. "But if the house is feeding on people, on their fear, their suffering, then maybe we cut it off. Maybe we deny it what it wants." "And how do we do that without becoming the next offering?" Yvonne muttered. Mitch stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense. Lena's right. We've got to figure out what's keeping this place alive. We can't just sit here and wait for it to take us one by one. If we're going back to that altar, we need to know exactly what we're looking for. Lena nodded, her mind racing. The journal mentioned a ritual, a way to summon the master of the house. It's risky, but if we can draw it out, maybe we can weaken it. Howard paled. You're talking about summoning that thing? The same thing that just told us we couldn't escape? I'm talking about making it vulnerable, Lena said. If we confront it on our terms, we might have a chance to break whatever connection it has to this place, to the altar. Yvonne's jaw tightened, but she nodded reluctantly. Fine. If we're doing this, we do it fast, before it decides we've overstayed our welcome. They agreed to meet at dawn, giving them a few hours to gather their courage and anything they thought might help them. Lena returned to her room, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She flipped through its pages again, looking for the passage she'd seen before. The handwriting was nearly illegible, the ink faded, but the meaning was clear. The master of the house may be summoned with the proper offering. To face it is to risk everything, but only by standing before it can the bond be severed. She read the words over and over, trying to steady her nerves. Whatever she found at the altar, whatever it demanded, she would face it. She had no choice. By dawn, Lena's hands were trembling. She wasn't sure if it was from lack of sleep or the mounting dread as they prepared to confront the altar once again. The others were silent, their expressions grim. Even Mitch, who had been the most level-headed, looked pale. Howard muttered under his breath as he checked his flashlight one more time, and Yvonne, jaw clenched, kept twisting her scarf around her hands. Lena held the journal close. The cryptic instructions and warnings swirled in her mind. The offering, the bond, it all came back to the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall. She was certain now. Whatever lay behind that door was part of the ritual, part of the force that bound the house to the master. Before venturing into the forest again, Lena insisted they return to the second floor. She couldn't shake the feeling that the room held something vital. If she was wrong, they would have wasted precious time. But if she was right, it might give them the edge they desperately needed. The others followed reluctantly, their steps dragging as if the house itself were pulling them back. When they reached the locked door, Lena pressed her ear against it, just as she had before. The faint scent of decay seeped through the wood, but the whispers she'd heard that first night were silent now. We can't just leave it locked, Lena said, her voice low. The journal talks about the offerings. The house keeps what it needs. I think, she paused, steadying herself, I think the house is keeping people in here. Yvonne frowned. You mean like prisoners? Lena hesitated, then nodded. Maybe not alive, but it's holding something, someone. Maybe Chris. Mitch crossed his arms. Then how do we open it? We don't have the key. Lena turned to the caretaker's room, a few doors down. The thought of entering his space made her stomach churn, but she was out of options. He must have a key. It has to be in his room. Help me look. The group moved as one, their fear momentarily giving way to determination. The caretaker's room was sparsely furnished, a simple bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a nightstand. No personal items, no photographs, just cold, utilitarian furnishings. The others rifled through drawers in the wardrobe, while Lena checked the nightstand. In the top drawer, buried under a stack of blank parchment, she found a small brass key. She held it up, her heart pounding. It felt too easy, but they had no time to question their luck. This has to be it. They returned to the locked room. With the others standing behind her, Lena inserted the key. Her fingers shook as she turned it, feeling the old mechanism grind against years of neglect. With a final click, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. A wave of putrid air hit them, and Lena had to cover her mouth and nose. The others coughed, muttering curses, but they stayed close. The room was darker than it should have been, given the daylight spilling in from the hallway. Lena raised her flashlight and swept it across the interior. The walls were covered in strange, pulsating growths. The wallpaper had rotted away, replaced by a slick, fleshy substance that seemed to breathe. Black tendrils crisscrossed the ceiling and floor, pulsating with a faint, otherworldly light. In the center of the room stood an object that made Lena's breath catch. It was a pedestal, carved from the same dark stone as the altar in the woods. Resting atop it was a tangle of bones, human bones, jumbled and fused together. The tendrils writhed around the pedestal, extending and retracting as if feeding from it. The air buzzed with a low hum, a sound that made Lena's teeth ache. Howard stumbled backward. "What the hell is this?" "It's an anchor," Lena whispered, though she didn't know how she knew. "It's tied to the altar. It's tied to the house." Mitch stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the grotesque scene. "If we destroy it, what happens?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know, but the journal said we have to sever the bond. If this thing is part of that bond, maybe destroying it will weaken the house's hold." Yvonne pulled a knife from her belt, her hands shaking. "We can't just leave it here. If this is what's feeding the house, we have to stop it." Before Lena could say anything, Yvonne moved forward and brought the knife down on one of the tendrils. The room seemed to convulse. A deep, guttural sound emanated from the walls, like a distant, wounded animal. The tendrils recoiled, writhing violently, but they didn't let go of the bones. Lena realized then that destroying the anchor wasn't going to be easy. The house wouldn't allow it, but they couldn't stop now. They had opened the door, they had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. If they wanted to escape, if they wanted to save themselves and somehow Chris, they had to break the house's hold, piece by horrifying piece. The house groaned as they left the room. It wasn't just the old wood settling, it was a long, mournful sound that followed them down the corridor, as if the house itself was aware of their intrusion. Lena clutched the journal tightly to her chest, her thoughts racing. The anchor they'd found was only part of the puzzle. If the house had a beating heart, it was somewhere deeper, beneath the creaking floorboards and rotting walls. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "The journal talks about the foundation of the house, the roots that run deep. Whatever's keeping this place alive is underground." Howard looked pale. "And you want us to go down there?" "Yes," Lena said. "If we don't cut it off at the source, it won't matter what we do up here. It'll just keep taking more people, more of us." Mitch gripped the knife at his side, nodding grimly. "Let's end this." Yvonne said nothing, her jaw tight, but she followed without protest. Howard muttered under his breath again, but he fell in line behind the group as they moved toward the basement. The air grew colder as they descended the narrow staircase, and the sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly. The flashlight beams seemed to falter, the darkness around them almost tangible. As they reached the basement, the air became heavier, thicker, and Lena felt an odd pressure in her ears, as if the house was squeezing them into submission. The basement wasn't what she expected. There were no shelves of old wine bottles, no dusty trunks or forgotten tools. Instead, the floor was rough, uneven stone, and the walls were lined with jagged roots that pulsed faintly with the same eerie glow they'd seen upstairs. The roots twisted and coiled, vanishing into the blackness that stretched beyond their flashlight's reach. "This isn't just a basement," Yvonne whispered. It's a cave." Lena shone her light forward. "It's older than the house. The house was built on top of it. The journal said this land was cursed long before the manor was constructed." They pressed on, their steps slow and deliberate. The low thrumming sound was louder now, vibrating through the stone underfoot. It felt like walking into the belly of a living creature. The deeper they went, the more distorted the space became. The roots grew thicker, the walls narrowing until they were squeezing through a narrow passage. Howard stumbled, catching himself against the wall. "I don't think we should." "Keep moving," Lena snapped. "We're close." The passage opened up into a cavernous chamber. At the center of the chamber stood the source of the pulsing light, an enormous, twisted tree. Its bark was blackened and split, oozing a dark, viscous substance that pooled at its roots. The roots stretched out like tentacles, connecting to the walls and ceiling, weaving into the very structure of the house above. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sound of the thrumming was deafening now, a relentless pulse that made Lena's head pound. "It's a heart," Mitch said quietly, "the heart of the house." Lena approached the tree, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She felt the weight of its presence pressing down on her chest. This was the source, the entity the house served, the master. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. To sever the bond is to risk everything. But what choice did they have? "How do we destroy it?" Yvonne asked, her voice barely audible over the thrum. Lena didn't have an answer. She looked at the dark pool at the tree's base, at the jagged roots pulsating with that sickly light. The journal hadn't given her a clear solution, only warnings. She reached out hesitantly, her hand stopping just short of the bark. The surface seemed to ripple, as if the tree was breathing. And then the voice returned. "You dare to defy me." It was the same voice they'd heard at the altar, but now it filled the chamber, echoing off the stone walls. Lena staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The others froze, their flashlights flaring wildly in the dark. "You have seen what happens to those who resist," the voice continued, cold and resonant. "You are no different. You will be consumed." Lena's mind raced. They had come too far to turn back. She glanced at Mitch and Yvonne, both gripping their knives, their expressions hardened. Howard, pale and trembling, still stood his ground. The house might have been ancient and powerful, but it was not infallible. They had to find its weakness. Lena turned her attention to the black substance pooling at the roots. If the roots connected the tree to the house, perhaps severing them would weaken it. "Cut the roots," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "We cut them all." Yvonne hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. Mitch followed, and together they slashed at the writhing roots. The tree shuddered violently, and the chamber roared as if in pain. Lena backed away, her flashlight fixed on the grotesque scene. The roots fought back, snapping and curling, but with each cut, the light dimmed. The thrum faltered, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. The house was weakening. Lena felt it. But it wasn't enough. A deep rumble shook the chamber, and the voice boomed louder. "You cannot win. This place will consume you." Lena clenched her fists. "Not if we destroy you first." As the others continued their desperate assault on the roots, Lena focused on the tree's core. There had to be a way to reach its center, to destroy whatever dark force it harbored. She stepped closer, ignoring the voice's taunts, ignoring the fear clawing at her chest. If this was the heart of the house, then she would tear it out. The chamber heaved like a living thing, the low thrum now an angry, pulsing roar. Lena could feel the vibrations in her chest, her bones rattling with each beat. The others continued hacking at the roots, but for every one they severed, it seemed as though two more sprouted in its place, twisting and coiling in defense of the blackened tree. The thick, oily substance oozing from its bark began to pool at their feet, and the air stank of rot and decay. Lena tightened her grip on the flashlight and the journal, scanning the pages for any guidance. The words swam before her eyes, distorted by her trembling hands. She focused on a passage she had skimmed before, something about confronting the master. Only by standing before it, only by drawing it out, can the bond be severed. But the offering must be made. "The offering," she whispered, her mind racing. "What does it mean? What are you talking about?" Mitch yelled over the roar. He was using both hands to hack at a particularly thick root, the veins in his neck straining. "The journal," Lena said, holding it up. "It keeps mentioning an offering. If we can force it out, we might weaken it enough to destroy it." Howard stepped back from the tree, his face pale and covered in sweat. "Offer what? One of us?" The words hit hard, but Lena shook her head. "No, there has to be another way. The house is already feeding on us, on the people it's taken. Maybe if we can reverse the ritual, if we give it something it doesn't expect." She stopped, realization dawning. "The journal says the house takes pain, fear, suffering. What if we refuse to give it what it wants?" "That's great," Yvonne said through gritted teeth, slicing at a root that kept lashing toward her. "But we're kind of surrounded here. How do we do that?" Lena glanced back at the tree, at the pulsing glow emanating from its core. The tendrils were thrashing violently now, reacting to their assault, but the light wasn't as strong as before. "It's protecting something," Lena said. "Whatever's at the center of this tree, it's the source. If we can get to it." "Get to it how?" Howard's voice cracked as he spoke. "This thing is fighting back. You saw what happened upstairs. We can't just walk up to it and smash it with a flashlight." Lena's mind was racing. If we can weaken it enough, just enough, maybe the bond breaks on its own. If we keep cutting, keep forcing it to react, it might lose control. "Big might," Mitch muttered, though he kept hacking at the roots. "It's all we've got," Lena said. She stepped closer to the tree, trying to ignore the cold dread crawling up her spine. The closer she got, the more the room seemed to shift, the walls pressing inward, the air growing heavier. Her flashlight flickered, and she thought she saw something move within the bark, a dark shape shifting just beneath the surface. "You want me?" Lena said aloud, her voice trembling but firm. "Here I am. You don't need my brother. Take me." "Lena!" Yvonne shouted, but Lena held up her hand. The tree shuddered, and the room's thrumming grew louder, almost a roar. The others froze as the tendrils began to retract, drawing back toward the trunk. The glow within the tree brightened, flaring like a dark sun, and the voice low, resonant, and inhuman filled the chamber again. "You would offer yourself." Lena swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "I offer nothing. I'm here to stop you, to break whatever you've done to this place." A deep, rumbling laugh shook the chamber. "You think you can stop me? You are no different than the others, lost, desperate. You will be consumed, as they were." Lena stepped closer. "You're weaker than you think. You need us, our fear, our pain. Without it, you have nothing." The tree's glow flickered. The tendrils lashed out again, but their movements were less coordinated now, more erratic. The others took the opportunity to strike, cutting into the roots while the tree's attention was focused on Lena. "You think you can deny me what I am owed?" the voice boomed. "I am the master of this house. I am eternal." "No," Lena said, her voice growing stronger. "You're not. You're just a parasite. You can't exist without us." The glow within the tree dimmed further, and the thrumming grew uneven. The walls seemed to ripple, the roots thrashing wildly. Lena felt the pressure in the room lessen, as if the house itself was faltering. "Now," she shouted, "keep cutting, don't stop." Mitch and Yvonne worked in unison, hacking at the roots until they finally reached the base of the trunk. The black ooze sprayed out, and the tree let out a deafening groan. The light at its core sputtered and pulsed, shrinking with every strike. Howard joined them, using his flashlight to bash at the roots, his fear momentarily overcome by desperation. Lena stepped back, her heart pounding. The tree's defenses were crumbling, its tendrils retreating. She didn't know if it would be enough, didn't know if they could sever the bond entirely. But they had weakened it, drawn it out. For the first time, she felt hope flickering inside her. And then the chamber began to collapse. The walls cracked, the floor splitting beneath their feet. The house roared, its voice no longer confident but desperate, angry. Lena shouted for the others to run, and together they scrambled toward the narrow passage. As they fled, Lena glanced back one last time, catching a glimpse of the tree's light fading, the tendrils recoiling into themselves. The house wasn't dead. Not yet, but it was wounded, and that meant they still had a chance. The group stumbled out of the collapsing chamber, their flashlights flickering as they climbed back up the narrow passage. The house trembled above them, each creak and groan echoing through the halls. Dust fell in thick curtains from the ceilings, and the once sturdy walls seemed to buckle inward as if the house itself was convulsing in pain. When they emerged into the main floor, it was as if they'd stepped into another world. The once faded grandeur of the manor had been replaced by something unrecognizable. The walls pulsed and writhed, their surfaces shimmering like liquid, shifting in and out of focus. The windows were gone, replaced by black voids, and the air was filled with a deep, thrumming vibration that pressed against their chests. The house was alive in a way it hadn't been before, angry, panicked, desperate. "What the hell's happening?" Mitch shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. "It's fighting back," Lena said, gripping the journal tightly. "We heard it, but it's not done. Not yet." The caretaker's voice cut through the chaos, cold and calm. "You've made a grave mistake." Lena spun around. The caretaker stood at the foot of the grand staircase, as composed as ever. But something was different now. His presence seemed larger, darker. The shadows bent around him, and his eyes glowed faintly with the same sickly light that emanated from the tree below. "You thought you could sever the bond," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But this house is eternal. It cannot be destroyed, and now it will take you all." Lena stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "You're wrong. It's weaker now. We can end this." The caretaker tilted his head slightly, his expression almost amused. "The house does not need to destroy you. It only needs you to choose." "Choose what?" Yvonne snapped, brandishing her knife. "To remain," the caretaker said simply, "to become part of the house, to give it your pain, your fear, to let it consume you, or..." Or what? Howard asked, his voice shaking. Or leave, the caretaker said, his gaze fixed on Lena. Leave this place and never return. But know this, if you leave, the house will recover. It will grow strong again. Others will come, and the cycle will continue. Lena's mind raced. The caretaker's words felt like a trap, a final attempt to manipulate them into giving in. The house wanted them to stay, to feed it. But leaving would mean abandoning Chris and everyone else who had been consumed. It would mean accepting that the house could never be defeated. I'm not leaving, Lena said, her voice steady. Not without my brother. The caretaker's glowing eyes narrowed. He is already part of the house. You cannot save him. That's not true, Lena shot back. He's still here. I heard him. He called to me. He's not gone. The caretaker's expression didn't change. The house keeps what it needs. You cannot change that. Lena turned to the others. We can stop it. We don't have to give in. Yvonne looked uncertain, her knife wavering. Howard's face was pale, his eyes darting between Lena and the caretaker. Mitch clenched his fists, his jaw tight. We don't have much time, Lena said, her voice rising above the thrumming. It's weak right now. We can finish this. Howard asked. What else can we do? Lena thought of the journal, of the passage she had read earlier. Only by standing before it, only by drawing it out, can the bond be severed. They had already weakened the house by severing its roots. Now, they had to face it directly. They had to confront whatever force was controlling the house and refuse to give it what it wanted. We go back, Lena said, to the altar. That's suicide, Yvonne shouted. You saw what it did down there. If we go back, we'll be... It's the only way, Lena interrupted. If we leave now, it wins. It'll recover, and it'll keep taking people. We have to stop it here now. Mitch stepped forward. I'm with you. Howard hesitated, but eventually nodded. Yvonne let out a frustrated sigh and gripped her knife. Fine, but if this gets me killed, I'm coming back to haunt you. Lena managed a weak smile. Fair enough. The group turned and headed back toward the stairs that led to the basement. The house groaned louder, as if sensing their resolve. The walls rippled, the floors buckled, but they kept moving. When they reached the altar, the tree was still thrashing, its glow dim but persistent. The room was colder now, the air sharp and bitter. The roots twitched, but they no longer lashed out. The house was too weak to fight them off. Lena stepped forward, the journal in one hand, her flashlight in the other. She stood before the altar, her heart pounding. You don't own us, she said, her voice shaking. You don't own me, and you don't own my brother. The glow within the tree flickered. The voice returned, softer now, but still menacing. You cannot escape. You are mine. No, Lena said firmly. We're not yours, not anymore. The others stood beside her, their weapons raised, their expressions defiant. Together they faced the tree, the altar, the ancient force that had held the house in its grip for so long. And then Lena did something she hadn't planned. She reached out and touched the tree. A surge of cold flooded her body, but she held firm. She felt the house's pain, its desperation, its hunger. She felt the countless lives it had taken, the fear and agony it had consumed. And she pushed back. She thought of Chris, of his voice, his smile, his laughter. She thought of all the people who had been lost here and refused to let their suffering continue. She poured her will into that moment, denying the house its power. The tree shuddered violently. The light flickered and dimmed, the roots curling back. The thrumming stopped. The house went still. Lena pulled her hand away, gasping for air. The others stared at her, wide-eyed. For a moment it seemed as if nothing had changed, and then the walls began to crumble, the floor shaking beneath their feet. Run! Lena shouted, and they scrambled up the stairs as the chamber collapsed behind them. When they reached the surface, the house was falling apart. The walls buckled, the roof caving in. They ran outside, the morning light blinding after so much darkness. Behind them, the manor groaned one last time before collapsing into rubble. They stood in silence, catching their breath as the dust settled. The house was gone. The master was gone. Lena felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't know if Chris was truly free, but she knew the house's hold was broken. It wouldn't take anyone else. Not again. For the first time in months, Lena felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived. They had won.